going to describe the schooling behavior that we've observed in Rio Grande, Silvery, Minnow, down in Los Lunas, and discuss the implications that schooling has for management of the species. Co-authors on this talk are Louis Toya and Allison Hudson. For those of you who haven't had the pleasure of visiting us in Los Lunas, this is a naturalized conservation aquaculture mesocosm, which we call the Refugium. And to give you an idea how big it is, that little white dash you see there, that's me and Allison Hudson sampling the fish with a 10-foot seine. Understanding a fish's behavior is critical for management, because if you know a fish's behavior, you know its life history. Once you know its behavior, you know where it lives, what it eats, what eats it, interactions with conspecifics, interactions with other species, and reproductive behavior. The best place to learn about a fish's behavior is in the wild. But these studies can be difficult with fish for one simple reason. Most biologists don't come equipped with a set of gills. In addition, if a species is endangered, its rarity can make contact with the species difficult in the wild. So what's a biologist to do? Well, most of the time we grab a handful and we bring them into the lab and do various nefarious tests to get them to reveal their deepest and darkest secrets. The problem is lab studies can be misleading because aquaria, tanks, small production ponds, and raceways are artificial, stressful environments. And everybody knows that if you're placed in an artificial and stressful environment, your behavior is not what it normally is. So we got a problem. The best places in the field where it's difficult and expensive, and the easiest places in the lab where the results can be misleading. And the problem with misleading results is if you base management on that, your management may be ineffective. So is there a nice third alternative? And the answer is, of course there is, which is why I asked the rhetorical question. And that's in a purpose-built conservation aquaculture facility. And fortunately for the collaborative program, the world's first large-scale conservation aquaculture facility exists in Los Lunas, and we've been raising fish there for 10 years. Conservation aquaculture is a relatively recent development in the field of aquaculture. It's considered to be the future for aquaculture-assisted fisheries for a simple reason. We're raising fish in an environment that mimics the wild. In addition, we don't use production aquaculture techniques such as feeding and control of predation, because what we want is we want to minimize domestication. We want to minimize the production of maladaptive hatchery behaviors. And in doing so, we lessen the likelihood that we're going to lower the fitness of the wild stock following augmentation. Now, one thing that's interesting is there's beginning to be a nice body of literature about conservation aquaculture. There's a big body of literature out there about the maladaptive effects that hatchery environments have on the behavior of fish. What you don't see is that you can use a conservation aquaculture facility to learn about the behavior of the fish. It's a wonderful bonus because it's a large naturalized environment. And that's what Allison Hudson, Louis Toya, and I have been doing down there in Los Lunas for the last 10 years. While we raise fish, we go out there and we just watch. Every day we watch hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours over the last 10 years. Where are the fish? What are they doing? How do they react to the songbird that just landed on the soft stem bulrush? How did they react to the kingfisher that landed on the guy wire? What did they do when that muskrat torpedoed right by them? What did they do when we suddenly pop up? How did they react when we raised the water level? How did they react when we lowered the water level? And the reason we spend so much time out there just watching is America's most important philosopher once noted that you can observe a lot just by watching. And over the last 10 years, we've changed our watching into observations that we've collated together and put into 2 referee papers. These papers are available on my ResearchGate website and Allison's ResearchGate website, along with other papers we've written about Rio Grande, Silvery, Minnow, and conservation aquaculture. The one behavior that really jumps out is the schooling behavior. If I had to describe this species in a single, short, simple sentence, I would say it's a highly schooling species. Schooling starts early. As soon as they can swim in a directional manner, they school. This is a school of 4,000 10-millimeter fish. The density in that school is about 22,000 per square meter. They school throughout their life. They tend to school by size. Here's a school of 740 adults. The density in this school is about 117 per square meter. This is a close-up of that school of adults. These are 60 to 70 millimeter fish, so you can see how tightly packed they were in that school. One of the interesting things about the school is, even though there's a couple of places we can go if we want to see a school, we don't always see the school there because the schools move throughout the course of the day. The schools break up and then reform. That nice school of adults I showed you, well, it broke up into 3 pieces. And there's one small part of the school meandering its way upstream to do whatever it decides it wants to do that day. When we did our spawning study, we wanted to find out how the adults reacted when the water inundated. So we converted ponds 2 and 4 into off-channel areas and only allowed the fish to enter through these 1-meter openings. We placed a Vincent camera in the pond right here facing the opening. And what we found was as the water entered those, small schools of fish entered with the water that was inundating the pond. So schooling is important for this species. They school from the moment they can swim up to the time when they're reproducing. And what's interesting is all our reproduction occurred in the off-channel areas and none occurred in the ponds. So now that we've seen that the schooling is an important behavior, we need to figure out how can we use this behavior to help us manage the species, because that's what we're trying to do. So we've come up with several implications for management. And the first is you need to take schooling behavior into account if you want to get accurate estimates of the population in the river. Schooling produces what is called a contiguous spatial distribution. And when a population has contiguous spatial distribution, you need to use a block sampling program. In addition, because they're schools and because the schools do move, randomly placed fixed sampling locations will most likely produce underestimations. Remember that school of 740 adults I showed you? There were only 750 adults in the whole Refugium. So if you came down and I gave you 10 randomly chosen fixed sampling locations and told you to tell me how many fish were in there, most likely you come back and tell me there's no fish. And I'd show you that school. So you must take this into account when you're sampling the river to determine how many fish are out there. The second implication for management is one that's kind of wacky. Feeding fish in the hatchery could increase mortality of wild fish following augmentation. I know most of you are probably sitting there thinking, what is that boy talking about? It's actually quite simple. It's a well-known phenomenon that feeding fish in a hatchery increases the aggression in the fish. This has been documented in many species. Schooling is a very delicate balance between the repelling and the attracting behaviors of the fish. So if you do something in the hatchery that is going to upset that balance, you're going to affect the ability of the fish to school. So when fed hatchery fish mix with wild fish, that school will be less cohesive and more dispersed. One of the most important things about schooling behavior is its anti-predator component. When the fish at the lead end of a school sees a predator, and it's a nice, tight, cohesive school, that information that the predator is there transfers across that school almost instantaneously. If the school is dispersed, it doesn't travel as fast. So the fish at the lag end of the school could only find out about the predator as they're about to be eaten. The other thing that's fascinating about schooling behavior is their anti-predator response to a predator. It is fascinating and it's really enjoyable. When the school sees a predator, the school explodes like a pyrotechnic on July 4th. And there is this wonderful dazzle effect. A dazzle effect will confuse a predator because predators tend to focus on one individual. And when you have the dazzle effect, they can't focus on that individual. And that's how many of the fish in the school can escape predation. But with a dispersed school, that dazzle effect is kind of muted. So that's how feeding fish in a hatchery, if the species schools, can increase the mortality following augmentation. The third implication for management is that spawning is likely a schooling activity. What we found was that the fish entered the floodplains as schools, and that's where we found the spawning. So what we need to do to find out if we want to manage the fish more effectively in the river is what is an effective schooling size that's needed for good reproduction? Is it 10 fish? Is it 100 fish? Is it 1,000 fish? I have no idea. And nobody in this room knows. But if we want to manage the species, I think it's something we need to find out. The other thing that this schooling behavior suggests is because we saw the species entering the floodplains with the incoming water, improving the species access to the off-channel areas would be important, so we should improve the hydraulic connectivity between the main channel and the floodplain. And this could be done by making lots of smaller floodplains throughout the length of each reach, because if the species is close to a floodplain during inundation, they can take advantage of it. But if a nice big 5-10 acre floodplain is 5 miles away, they might not know it's flooding, and so they might not access it. So this is a third one. So those are the three that we've come up with. I'm sure somebody in here is a lot smarter than me. And if you can come up with number 4 and 5, I would really like you to tell me what it is. We appreciate the funding from the Bureau of Reclamation for allowing us to culture the fish in the refugium, which enabled us to make these observations. And the opinions that I expressed are those of the author and not the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission. And I thank you for your time.
That was a great talk. You made a comment about how the fish were not spawning in the ponds, but they were in the off-channel.
You got it flipped.
I got it flipped.
That was misspoke. That is what you said.
Oh, it is? Okay,
that
I need a tongue transplant.
Okay. Well,
No,
can you just elaborate on that?
Okay, we had repeatability within year and across years. All the spawning took place in the off-channel areas, not in the stream. And if I said it the wrong way, I apologize.
And what do you think the implications are then for restoration? Basically, you're saying that create sort of all these inlets into the floodplain, essentially all up and down.
Yeah.
Focus on larger.
I think a lot of smaller ones, well, there's nothing wrong with having a few large ones, but I think having a lot of smaller ones could help, because it's the idea that if that big one is flooding and the fish in the school are 5 miles away, they might not notice it. But if they're 100 yards away, they're going to notice it. And it was just fascinating. I mean, they literally just followed the water right up in there. And it was, and I apologize for any confusion.
What are the predators of silvery minnow?
What?
What are the predators of silvery minnow? You talked about their responses to predators, but what in the river is actually predating them?
Well, the ones that we've seen in our system are their reactions to birds. And it's very definite because we can have fun with them. If we stand with our back to the sun and we see a school and we can do this, you will see that explosion. We see them react to kingfishers. Interestingly, when I was talking about that muskrat, we've seen a muskrat blast through a school of fish. And all they do is go, they say, oh, it's all ratty. He doesn't bother us. In terms of what's out there in the river, I imagine just about anything will eat them. I mean, they are basically, breakfast, lunch, and supper for most critters out there in the wild. But the ones that we see mostly in the refugium with that wonderful display is against birds.
So your pictures all show really clear water. And my question is do you think that these schools continue when there's turbidity? And maybe it's not as important for predator avoidance?
I can't answer that question because I have no idea.
The answer is yes. Yeah, I mean, turbidity is the one thing at the Refugium that we haven't introduced much because we have to then clean it up, so that's difficult, but it is,
We have not been able to.
yeah, so, yeah, but the water has become more turbid than some of your pictures show, and I think the observations still show that. One of the things that Refugium does have is it does have bird wires, so we don't get large, birds coming into the facility eating all the fish, because we are trying to get enough fish out into the river. But then, so I was also wondering, Becky, it's being mentioned, the food availability. Did you do observations? Have you been able to kind of see how they're foraging and where they're eating and what they're eating?
Well, we have seen that areas where we had black fly larvae, that they use that like a all-you-can-eat smorgasbord. I mean, they'll clean up that. In one of the most interesting things about the schools is if a school stays in an area for a while and then moves, that area where the school was rather static looks like a pasture where there was a herd of horses. That area has been like really clean cropped, and it's got a very, not rough or anything, it's smooth. So we have seen that. And as for, other than that, what they're eating, the best is that the study done by Becky Bixby, those reports that she's written, that she details what was in their guts throughout the year.
So, have you observed with very low numbers if the school behavior persists? There's like 10, I wonder about really low numbers, really, low years, there's very few fish out there. In the hatchery, have you seen when there's 10 fish, or 20 fish, if that's school behavior, or do you always have hundreds of fish?
Well, I've seen in our raceway, we have 53-foot raceways.
Yeah.
And I have seen in the raceways, when there's only been a handful of fish, they go into a small school. So even when there's only a handful of fish out there, and that's one of the interesting things about the raceways, is sometimes you go out to the raceway and there might be a couple thousand fish in that 53-foot raceway, and you're looking, where are they? And all of a sudden, there they all are in this small spot in the raceway. So they really do school. This has been shown in the eastern silvery minnow too. So this isn't just new for this. So